Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're tuning in right now, there's a very good chance you're carrying something heavy.
Yeah, I'd say it's almost a guarantee for most of us.
Right. You might be navigating this packed schedule, dealing with an endless list of professional obligations, or
Or honestly, just trying to process the sheer volume of information that hits your brain the second you wake up and check your phone.
exactly. I mean, we live in an era characterized by chronic overwhelm. We're constantly absorbing data, opinions, demands.
Exhausting.
Really is. So for the duration of our time together today, we're going to attempt something that might feel a little countercultural.
We are going to slow all the way down.
Yes. Our mission today is not to add another complex framework to your cognitive load. Instead, we're looking at a source that acts as a profound filter.
A filter designed to help you clear the clutter and isolate what actually matters.
We are examining extensive excerpts from the 2026 edition of Junior Rostirola's book, Café Deus Pai, which translates to Coffee with God the Father.
And this is a text that uses very simple daily metaphors to tackle some of the most complex psychological and spiritual challenges we face.
And the structural approach of this text.
That's actually its first major intervention against that modern epidemic of information overload you just described.
How so?
Well, we exist in this landscape where we are bombarded by a relentless stream of micro-content, right? It fragments our attention.
Yeah, it keeps us in a state of shallow processing.
Exactly. What this book does is deliberately hit the brakes on that consumption cycle. It's formatted as a year-long journey. 365 daily portions of love.
Framed around a morning coffee.
Right. A ritual that implies pausing, sitting, savoring. Structurally, each day presents just one anchor thought.
Accompanied by a specific highlight phrase, a suggested reading, and quite significantly, physical space for the reader to make their own notes.
Which is a brilliant pedagogical tool. It forces you out of passive consumption and into active reflection.
You aren't meant to binge this material.
No, not at all. You're meant to sit with a single concept, internalize it, and map it onto the specific realities of your day before you even encounter the next idea.
That concept of a cognitive circuit breaker is so necessary right now, but what really anchors this entire text is a concept introduced right at the beginning.
The Atos de Amor movement.
Yes, the acts of love movement. And the premise here completely disrupts the idea of a private, isolated spirituality.
The author is very explicit about this. The objective of these 365 days isn't just to acquire a bunch of theological knowledge.
Or to just achieve a personal sense of inner peace.
The goal is contagion. The text argues that genuine love, the kind received in these quiet moments, has to inevitably spill over into the community.
It challenges you, the listener, to transform these daily reflections into incredibly simple, tangible acts of kindness toward the people around you.
It's essentially arguing that a devotional life that doesn't change how you treat your neighbor, your coworker, or your family
Is fundamentally incomplete.
Exactly. It connects private devotion to public responsibility in a very seamless way. The text weaves in specific challenges designed to push the reader toward outward expressions of care.
It builds an ecosystem where spiritual nourishment is intrinsically linked to practical empathy.
Which is a crucial foundation for everything else we're going to discuss today. The text insists that being well-informed or feeling spiritually uplifted is only half of the equation.
Right. The metric of success here is behavioral change. It's about how that internal shift alters your external interactions.
That gives us a fantastic trajectory for our conversation today.
It does. We're going to navigate through some of the most striking metaphors this text uses to provoke that change.
We'll look at its arguments regarding the paralyzing nature of our past and the mechanics of letting go.
We'll examine how it redefines the concept of success in the face of our incredibly brief lifespans.
We'll also spend some serious time looking at the painful, confusing periods of waiting in life.
And why the text insists those periods are not empty time. We'll explore the idea of unexpected miracles requiring unconventional obedience.
And finally, we will look at the deeply practical aspects of building a legacy in the quiet, unglamorous moments of family life.
It's a profound roadmap, and what strikes me about these specific themes is how they systematically dismantle the default assumptions that drive so much of our modern anxiety.
So let's get right into that dismantling process.
Let's do it. The text addresses the concept of the past with a very aggressive, striking analogy early on, specifically in the entry for January 7th.
The rearview mirror trap.
Yes, the author compares living attached to your past, holding on to traumas, unresolved pain, old deceptions, to driving a car down the highway while exclusively staring into the rearview mirror.
It's a visceral image.
It really is.
Yeah.
If you try to navigate forward momentum while your focus is entirely locked on what is behind you, a crash isn't just a possibility.
It's a mathematical certainty. The physics of that metaphor translate perfectly to human psychology.
Because we have this well-documented tendency toward rumination, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. When we experience deep hurt or betrayal, our minds naturally loop back to those events. We try to process them, or we try to protect ourselves from future harm.
But as the text points out, this protective mechanism can easily become a trap. Staring in the rearview mirror freezes us in time.
We become so consumed by the debris of our history that we are entirely blind to the opportunities and the path directly in front of us.
But the solution the text proposes here is highly nuanced. It doesn't advocate for amnesia.
Right, it isn't telling you to just magically forget the terrible things that have happened to you. Forgetting trauma is often biologically and psychologically impossible.
So what does it suggest instead?
It argues for a radical reframing of that history. It focuses entirely on healing, which is a very different process than forgetting.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
The author suggests that true freedom comes when you can look at your scars with gratitude rather than shame or regret.
Gratitude for a scar. That sounds difficult, I know. But the theological assertion here is that the divine can repurpose those specific instances of pain, using them as seeds for a new beginning.
The scar transforms from a symbol of defeat into proof of survival.
Yes, and a credential for future empathy and growth.
I see the appeal of that reframing, but we really have to acknowledge how incredibly difficult that is in practice. Looking at a scar, something that represents a betrayal, a loss, a profound injustice, and feeling gratitude feels almost entirely unnatural.
It really does. Our instinct is to hide it.
To be angry about it.
Yeah.
Or to let it define us as victims.
It's deeply counterintuitive, which is why the text moves into an even more practical, albeit heavy, metaphor the very next day on January 8th.
Okay, let's unpack this. Literally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The author takes this abstract concept of the past and materializes it as excess baggage.
He likens our emotional state to the anxiety of standing in an airport check-in counter.
You place a massive suitcase on the scale, and you just know you are over the limit. Like the penalty for overweight luggage. The author argues that we all carry a baggage of dreams, sure, but also of pains, difficulties, unresolved grudges.
And when that bag gets too heavy, it paralyzes the traveler.
You either have to open the bag right there in front of everyone and leave some things behind, or you pay a massive tax to keep carrying that extra weight.
And the tax in this analogy is what makes it so resonant. When we refuse to let go of our emotional baggage, the family dilemmas, the resentments, the refusal to forgive, we pay a daily tax.
An emotional, physical, and spiritual tax.
We pay with our peace of mind, we pay with our physiological health through stress, and our ability to engage fully in the present.
The text argues that to move toward the future God has prepared, you cannot simply drag the heavy suitcase along and hope you magically get stronger.
You must stop, open the baggage, analyze it item by item, and consciously choose what you're going to leave behind.
And unpacking is exhausting work. Facing the reality of what we've been dragging around requires a level of vulnerability that most of us actively avoid.
We would rather pay the tax and keep our resentment packed away in the dark. It requires immense courage to unpack.
But the text reassures the reader that this unpacking process is essential for agility. The journey ahead requires a lightness of spirit.
A lightness that is fundamentally incompatible with the dead weight of past grievances.
Which brings us to a parable from January 9th that completely reframes how we deal with the weight that other people put on us.
Ah, the parable of the donkey.
Yes. It's an old story from the Iberian Peninsula. An elderly donkey falls into a deep well.
The owners assess the situation, decide the donkey is too old and the well is too deep.
And they conclude that a rescue just isn't worth the effort. So they make this grim decision to bury the animal alive to end its suffering. They grab their shovels and start throwing dirt down into the well.
It's an incredibly bleak premise, but it perfectly captures the feeling of being overwhelmed by circumstances.
When it seems like the world has simply given up on you and is actively trying to bury you.
But the narrative pivots brilliantly. Every time a shovelful of dirt hits the donkey's back, instead of succumbing to the weight, the donkey shakes it off.
The dirt falls to the floor of the well, and the donkey simply steps up onto it.
Shake it off, step up.
The owners keep throwing dirt, and the donkey keeps stepping on it. Eventually, the very dirt that was intended to be its grave forms a ramp,
Allowing the donkey to literally step out of the well.
It's a masterful illustration of resilience, and the author uses it to ask the reader a very direct question. How many times does life throw dirt on you?
He categorizes this dirt as criticisms, failures, harsh words, injustices, contrary circumstances.
All of this feels heavy and suffocating when you're already in a dark place.
But the text connects this directly to the theological principle in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, that all things work together for the good of those who love God.
The invitation here is to adopt the donkey strategy, but let me push back on that slightly. Is there a danger here of slipping into a sort of toxic positivity? If someone is experiencing real, profound trauma or systemic injustice, telling them to just shake it off and step up can sound a bit dismissive.
I completely understand why it might sound that way.
It can sound like we're telling people to ignore the reality of their pain and just put on a brave face.
That is a crucial distinction to make. And if we look closely at the mechanics of the parable, it actually guards against that toxic positivity.
How so?
The donkey isn't pretending the dirt isn't falling. It isn't ignoring the reality of the shovel or the darkness of the well. The act of shaking it off requires feeling the weight of the dirt first.
Acknowledging its presence.
Yes, and then making an active, strenuous decision to utilize it rather than surrender to it. It's not about denial. It's about active processing and repurposing.
So the dirt doesn't disappear. The criticism still stings. The injustice is still a reality.
Precisely. The text doesn't promise a life free from dirt being thrown at you, but it argues that your response changes the function of that dirt.
What was intended for your burial becomes the mechanism for your elevation.
It's a profound call to agency. The text states that God transforms curses into blessings, pain into growth, and offense into maturity.
You cannot control the circumstances attempting to bury you, but you maintain the ultimate agency in how you utilize the debris.
If shaking off the dirt of our past is step one, the book suggests step two is entirely redefining what we are actually stepping toward,
which completely upends our modern definition of success. This brings us to the themes explored on January 10th.
The author asks the reader point blank, what makes you successful?
If you poll the average person today, the answer is almost universally tied to material and social conquest.
It's the title on your LinkedIn profile, the square footage of your house, your financial portfolio,
your social media metrics. It's a relentless, exhausting pursuit of status, driven by a culture that equates net worth with human worth.
The text acknowledges that working hard and enjoying the fruits of your labor are entirely valid, but it vehemently rejects the idea that these pursuits should occupy the top tier of our priority list.
It references the biblical directive from Matthew chapter 6, which commands seeking first the kingdom of God with the promise that material needs will be added as a secondary outcome.
The core argument is a complete inversion of the world's value system.
The author argues that a true, genuine sense of success is fundamentally about a healthy, intimate, and deep relationship with God. Earthly wealth is categorized as strictly secondary.
For the undeniable pragmatic reason that we take absolutely none of it with us when our time is up.
It's a sobering reality check. Why dedicate your entire existence to accumulating currency that holds zero value in the next reality?
This redefinition of success is inextricably linked to the text's observations on the brevity of life, specifically in the entries from June 9th and June 12th.
The ruthless pace of time.
Yes, the author taps into a universal, somewhat terrifying human experience, the perception of time accelerating.
He notes how incredibly fast childhood evaporates and how quickly children grow up and leave the home.
When we are young, time feels expansive. But as adults, weighed down by routines, responsibilities, and the pursuit of that material success we just discussed.
The years just seem to vanish in an instant. We all feel that acceleration. You blink, and an entire decade is behind you.
And usually, when we realize time is short, our instinct is to panic and speed up.
We try to cram more productivity into our days. We sacrifice sleep. We hustle harder to build our little empires before the clock runs out.
But the author's proposed solution to this existential dread is the exact opposite of what culture tells us to do.
It's entirely countercultural. The text insists that the antidote to the ruthless pace of time is not to accelerate, but to intentionally take your foot off the gas.
A call to prioritize intentionality over sheer velocity. The author urges the reader to stop dedicating their finite energy entirely to gathering material goods.
And instead to hyperfocus on relational investments. He makes the profound observation that at the end of a life, what truly makes a difference isn't the final balance in a bank account.
It's the depth of love shared and the joy experienced in the company of the people around you. It elevates human connection above all material and professional pursuits.
The phrase he uses is, "We take our foot off the accelerator and learn to value what really matters." This mindset completely alters how we view the concept of a legacy.
Which is the focus of the May 17th message.
The text lists off these monolithic historical figures: Aristotle, Isaac Newton, Martin Luther,
Shakespeare, Einstein, Marie Curie.
Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela. These are individuals whose influence literally shaped the course of human history.
But the author uses those figures to set up a very stark dichotomy. He immediately points out that history also permanently records the names of individuals remembered solely for their wickedness,
for the atrocities they committed and the destruction they caused. By placing these extremes side by side, the text forces the reader into a corner of personal application.
It demands that you answer the question, how do you want to be known and remembered?
Because whether we are conscious of it or not, we are all building a legacy right now. Every micro-interaction in the present is casting an echo into the future.
If you view your life through that lens, it gives an immense, almost overwhelming weight to the mundane moments.
If your life ended today, what is the specific echo you are leaving behind? The text suggests that a true child of God should leave an echo of generosity, dedication, and love.
But for many of us, the honest answer might be that we are just leaving an echo of a stressed-out, perpetually busy person who accumulated a lot of things.
That demands a fundamental shift in perspective from the temporal to the eternal. When you internalize the idea that your daily, seemingly insignificant choices, how you handle a frustrating email, how you speak to your spouse after a long day, how you conduct your business ethics,
that those are the actual building blocks of your permanent legacy. It strips away the illusion that only the big moments matter.
The legacy is built in the quiet, uncelebrated decisions to choose love over expediency.
And that transition from the temporal to the eternal requires a lot of refinement.
Which brings us to one of the most challenging sections of this deep dive. We have to talk about the wilderness, the waiting room, and the agonizing process of spiritual maturity.
The entry from May 12th grounds this in a profoundly relatable everyday scenario: the child and the injection.
The author shares a story about taking his young son to a clinic to receive a vaccination. Anyone who has ever held a toddler while they get a shot knows exactly how emotionally taxing this is.
It's a scenario characterized by a massive asymmetry of knowledge. The author describes the scene vividly. He's holding his son securely, but as the nurse approaches with the needle, the child is consumed by terror.
The child cries out, "Dad, save me!"
Look at it from the child's perspective. The person who represents ultimate safety and love in their universe is inexplicably allowing a stranger to inflict pain on them.
Because the child lacks the cognitive development to grasp the concepts of immunology, preventative medicine, or long-term health, they only know the immediate sharp pain of the needle. It's heartbreaking in the moment, but the author uses this to construct a brilliant theological metaphor regarding human suffering and our relationship with the divine.
As a father, he possessed the broader perspective. He knew that the momentary sharp pain of the injection was an absolute necessity to protect his son from devastating, life-threatening diseases down the road.
The child didn't need a medical degree to understand the vaccine. The child just needed to trust the character of the father.
The epistemology of trust is central here. The text uses this metaphor to confront our human demand for total comprehension.
When we are plunged into painful situations or when life takes a devastating turn, our immediate reaction is to demand an explanation from God. We want to see the blueprints.
But the author argues that just as a toddler cannot comprehend the science of a vaccine, human beings simply lack the cosmic perspective to understand the intricacies of the divine plan.
The text asserts that we do not need to know the granular details of why a specific pain is permitted. What is required is courage, goodwill, and fundamentally obedience.
Obedience, in this framework, is defined as an act of supreme, radical trust that the Father knows best, even when the experience feels exclusively like a needle.
And sometimes that required endurance isn't just a momentary sting, it's a grueling, protracted journey.
The author illustrates this on May 13th by recounting a family hike on a trail known for its 12 waterfalls.
He describes the ascent as incredibly steep, treacherous and physically exhausting. In fact, he notes that many people they encountered on the trail simply gave up.
They turned back before reaching the summit, missing the most magnificent waterfall at the top.
It's a perfect physical representation of the spiritual ascent. The author is making the point that the spiritual walk is rarely a linear, smooth path. It requires intense exertion.
What is particularly vital in this passage is the explicit statement that God does not exist to simply bulldoze the obstacles out of our way.
We often pray for the mountain to be removed, but the text suggests that God's methodology is to leave the mountain and instead provide the capacity, the resilience, and the internal strength required to climb it.
The ultimate reward, the beauty at the summit, is exclusively reserved for those who refuse to turn back when their muscles burn.
Which transitions us into the deepest, most difficult part of the spiritual journey discussed in the book, the desert.
The entries from August 24th and August 30th confront our modern obsession with instant gratification.
We live in a culture that sells the myth of overnight success. We want the life hack, the shortcut, the 5-minute miraculous transformation where all our problems are resolved by tomorrow morning.
The desire to bypass the process is perhaps the ultimate modern temptation, but the text aggressively dismantles this illusion by examining the actual historical narratives of major biblical figures.
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and David.
None of these individuals experienced a frictionless rise to their destinies. They all endured agonizing, drawn-out periods of preparation characterized by severe hardship.
The text spends time on David, which is a prime example. David is anointed by the prophet Samuel as the future king of Israel while he is just a young boy. It is the ultimate promise of greatness.
But he doesn't walk from that anointing to a throne.
Not even close. He goes right back out to the fields to smell like sheep.
Exactly. He returns to obscurity. And not only that, he faces the intense jealousy of his brothers, he's thrust into warfare, and eventually he spends years living as a fugitive in the wilderness.
Hiding in caves, literally pretending to be insane at one point just to survive the wrath of the current king, Saul.
The psychological whiplash between the promise of the throne and the reality of the cave is staggering.
And the text highlights Joseph as well. He has these prophetic dreams of leadership and influence, and his immediate reward is being thrown into a pit by his own brothers.
Sold into human trafficking.
Falsely accused of sexual assault by his master's wife, and thrown into an Egyptian dungeon where he is forgotten for years.
The delay between the promise and the fulfillment is measured in decades of suffering.
The critical insight the text offers here is a stark warning. Many people want the glorious destiny, but they absolutely reject the discipline of the process.
They desire the harvest, but they refuse to suffer through the planting and the waiting.
The text redefines the desert or the waiting room. It is not a place of abandonment. It is a highly active classroom.
The waiting is the curriculum. God is utilizing that friction to mold character, to burn off arrogance, and to construct the deep spiritual infrastructure necessary to handle the immense weight of the promise.
If you somehow manage to skip the steps and grab the promise early, it will crush you because you lack the character to sustain it.
So to you, listening right now, if you are sitting in what feels like an endless waiting room, or if you feel like you are wandering aimlessly in a desert, this text is speaking directly to that despair.
It's telling you not to rush the process. You can't pull the cake out of the oven halfway through and expect it to be a masterpiece. The waiting is not a mistake. The waiting is the preparation.
Now let's explore how the text views the actual mechanics of the miraculous.
Yes. The entry for May 23rd takes us into the Gospel of John, chapter 9, examining a story that is profoundly weird by our modern sensibilities.
It's the account of Jesus encountering a man who had been blind since birth. But the focus here is on the deeply unconventional, almost offensive method Jesus uses to heal him.
He doesn't just declare the man healed with a word, and he doesn't just lay hands on him.
No, Jesus spits on the ground, mixes his saliva with the dirt to create mud, physically smears that mud onto the blind man's eyes.
And then issues a strange command: go wash in the pool of Siloam.
It's a deeply scandalous method, especially when you consider the social stigma of blindness in the first century, coupled with the indignity of having someone spit in the dirt and rub it on your face.
But the author extracts a profound principle from this bizarre interaction. He highlights the fact that Jesus offered the man 0 guarantees.
He didn't say, "Let me put this mud on you and you will see." He simply applied the mud and gave a difficult, humiliating instruction.
The blind man now has to navigate his way through the city to a specific pool with mud crusting on his face. The level of trust required to take that first step is staggering.
He had every reason to feel mocked and foolish.
And that vulnerability is the crux of the lesson. The miracle was entirely contingent on the man's willingness to obey an instruction that made absolutely no logical sense.
The text argues that obedience must precede the miracle. We often demand that God explain the mechanics of how a situation will be resolved before we agree to take action.
But the author suggests that God frequently utilizes unconventional, illogical methods precisely to test whether our reliance is on our own human understanding or on His authority.
If we restrict our obedience only to the things that make sense to us, we completely lock ourselves out of the supernatural.
That theme of maintaining faith when all logical evidence points to despair continues on May 24th with the narrative of Jairus.
Jairus is a prominent synagogue leader, a man of status, but he is brought to his knees because his young daughter is dying.
He begs Jesus to come to his house and intervene. They begin the journey, but before they arrive, the absolute worst-case scenario unfolds.
Messengers arrive from the house and deliver the crushing blow. Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?
It is the ultimate moment of finality. The medical reality is fixed. The clock has run out.
But Jesus turns to a devastated Jairus and issues an astonishing command. Don't be afraid. Just believe.
It is a command that borders on the absurd when viewed through a purely rational lens.
The author uses this scene to illustrate the intense conflict that often arises between bleak reality and faith. The physical evidence presented to Jairus demanded absolute despair.
Death is the ultimate finality in human experience. But Jesus invites Jairus to completely ignore the empirical evidence and anchor his trust to a higher reality.
The text urges the reader to stop looking forward with paralyzing fear at all the worst-case scenarios, and instead to look upward with faith.
The profound takeaway is that God specializes in overriding human finality. He holds the capacity to transform absolute death into life, and the deepest despair into unexpected hope.
He, not the physical circumstances, possesses the final word.
The book reinforces this idea that God subverts human expectations by looking at the types of people he chooses to use. On August 4th, the text examines Naaman the Syrian.
Naaman is a highly decorated, powerful commander of an enemy army. He holds immense prestige, wealth, and authority.
But beneath his impressive armor, he is rotting away from leprosy, a terminal and socially isolating disease. He is desperate for a cure.
And the key to his survival is delivered by the most improbable messenger imaginable, a nameless captive Israelite servant girl who works in his household.
The socio-political dynamics of that story are staggering. You have a powerful military commander of a conquering nation who has to humble himself to listen to a slave girl from the nation he subjugated.
And then, when he seeks out the prophet Elisha, the instruction he receives is deeply insulting to his ego. He is told to go wash 7 times in the muddy, unimpressive Jordan River.
The text uses Naaman to demonstrate how God actively dismantles human hierarchy and pride. Naaman had to completely strip off his armor, his ego, and his nationalistic pride to access the healing he desperately needed.
We see a similar subversion of power on August 27th with the Roman centurion.
Here is another military leader, an officer of the brutal occupying force that was subjugating the Jewish people.
Yet he approaches Jesus, a Jewish rabbi, with a level of humility and a profound understanding of spiritual authority that leaves Jesus himself amazed.
The centurion essentially says, I understand the chain of command. I don't even need you to dignify my house with your presence. Just speak the word from right here, and my servant will be healed.
Both the narrative of Naaman and the centurion illustrate a vital theological point. God deliberately bypasses the systems of logic, social standing, and expected protocol that we rely on.
He utilizes the unlikely, unconventional methods, improbable messengers, and even individuals considered enemies, to require a faith that is pure and entirely unadulterated by human systems of power.
The text challenges the reader to deeply consider whether they are missing out on their own miracle simply because they are waiting for it to be delivered in a package they deem socially acceptable or logically sound.
We try to dictate the terms of our own deliverance, and in doing so, we miss the profound beauty of God's unconventional methods.
Now, as we bring all these massive theological concepts down to the ground level, we have to look at how the text applies them to our daily routines, our families, and our private lives.
On January 6th, the author shares a deeply moving story that anchors this entire philosophy.
The knot in the bedsheet.
Yes. He describes an incredibly humble, exhausted father who worked brutal, unrelenting hours just to keep food on the table. He worked so late that when he finally got home, his young son was already fast asleep.
The father rarely had the opportunity to interact with the boy while he was awake.
But without fail, every single night, this exhausted man would walk into his son's room, stand by the bed, and tie a simple, small knot in the corner of the boy's bedsheet.
It's a devastatingly beautiful image of micro-intentionality. The text highlights that this silent, seemingly insignificant gesture was a profound daily proof of presence.
It was the father's tangible way of communicating, I was here, I saw you, and I love you, even when the relentless grind of survival kept them physically separated during the day.
The author utilizes this intimate story to draw a parallel to the parable of the sower, issuing a stark warning about how the frantic pace, the worries, and the sheer exhaustion of modern life can easily choke out the vitality of our most precious relationships.
The direct challenge to you, the listener, is inescapable here. The text asks, how are you planting seeds of love in your own family today?
It completely reframes our understanding of what it takes to maintain relationships. We often think love requires grand, cinematic gestures, expensive vacations, or massive blocks of free time that we simply don't have.
But the text argues that profound love only requires sincerity. A quick note left on a counter, a brief word of genuine encouragement, or a simple knot in a bedsheet.
It forces us to look past our own exhaustion and ask if we are still finding ways to ensure our families know we are present and that they are prioritized.
This intense focus on the sanctuary of the family is expanded upon significantly in the May 19th entry, where the text completely recontextualizes the epic narrative of Noah's Ark.
Traditionally, this story is viewed through a lens of global apocalypse, environmental catastrophe, and divine judgment.
But the author zooms in on a much more intimate, domestic angle. He points out that while the entire surrounding culture was spiraling into chaos and inevitable destruction, Noah's primary directive was to construct a vessel specifically designed to save his family.
The book argues that prioritizing your family in a chaotic world requires active construction. It isn't enough to just physically coexist in the same house, staring at separate screens.
Prioritizing family means intentionally building bulkheads of care, communication, and spiritual protection.
The text suggests that in a culture that often feels like a flood of negativity, anxiety, and moral confusion, your home must be constructed as an ark.
It is proof that God's grand plans often begin with the preservation and sanctification of a single family unit.
And building that kind of resilient structure, whether it is a strong family or a robust personal character, requires a foundation that the author explores deeply on August 3rd.
He introduces the concept of hidden root systems, pulling from Banning Liebscher's book, Rooted.
The text drives home the vital point that a mature Christian life must develop its primary root system in the secret place of prayer, far removed from the applause or observation of an audience.
This is a direct echo of Jesus' instruction in Matthew 6 to go into your room, close the door, and pray to the Father in secret.
Exactly, and the text utilizes Liebscher's concepts to issue a scathing critique of what we might call performative religion.
In our current hyper-connected era, there is a massive temptation to broadcast every aspect of our spirituality for social capital. We want the dopamine hit of public piety.
But the author argues that true resilience and genuine power only cultivate in the spaces where absolutely no one else is watching.
Consider the biological function of a root system. It exists entirely in the dark, pushing through dirt and rock to find hidden sources of water.
It is invisible, yet it is the only thing that keeps the massive tree standing when a hurricane hits, and it is the sole source of nourishment that allows the tree to bear fruit.
The text warns that if your public spiritual persona is more developed than your private, hidden life with God, you are essentially a cut flower sitting in a vase.
You might look vibrant and beautiful for a fleeting moment, but you are already dying because you are severed from the source.
That is an incredibly sobering image. Real, sustainable growth happens in the dark, in the quiet, unglamorous moments.
And speaking of the difficult mechanics of growth, we have to look at the entry from August 6th, which tackles the concept of maturity.
The author references Luciano Subira's book, Maturity, and he shatters a very common misconception. He states unequivocally that spiritual and emotional maturity does not happen passively.
Simply accumulating birthdays and getting older does not make you mature. It is a vital distinction to make. The passage of time merely ages our physical bodies. It is the active processing of trials and friction that matures our souls.
The text describes this maturation as an arduous, demanding, and frequently painful process. To illustrate this, it introduces the powerful metaphor of God as a lapidary.
The master craftsman who cuts, grinds, and polishes gemstones.
When you pull a raw diamond out of the earth, it doesn't look like something you would put in a ring. It looks like a cloudy, unimpressive piece of rock.
It has to be subjected to immense friction, precise cutting, and intense grinding to reveal its brilliance.
Precisely. And the lapidary process is violent. The author writes that God utilizes the trials, the tribulations, the disappointments, and the daily friction of life as the tools to polish us.
He takes our rough, unrefined nature and subjects it to the grinding wheel to shed our arrogance, our selfishness, and our impatience.
It is a profound invitation to submit to the sovereign, sometimes painful shaping process, trusting the skill of the craftsman.
The pain of the grinding wheel isn't meant to destroy the stone. It is meant to reveal the facets that reflect light.
As we step back and view this entire journey, the roadmap this text has laid out is challenging but incredibly clear.
It's begging you to open your luggage, pay the emotional cost of unpacking your past, and stop staring into the rearview mirror.
It's urging you to adopt the resilience of the donkey, utilizing the dirt thrown at you as stepping stones.
It challenges you to trust the agonizingly slow, confusing process of the waiting room, knowing the harvest requires the desert.
It demands that you embrace unconventional instructions with bold, illogical faith.
And ultimately, it calls you to focus fiercely on the quiet, uncelebrated acts of love. Building an ark for your family, tying a knot in a bed sheet, and growing deep, hidden roots in the dark.
But the critical question remains, what do you actually do with this? We noted at the beginning that a portion of love, no matter how profoundly analyzed or beautifully written, is entirely useless if it remains sitting in the cup.
Insight without implementation is just intellectual entertainment. The true value of our deep dive today isn't that you absorb some interesting metaphors. It is how you will map those metaphors onto your immediate reality.
It is about identifying the specific resentment you need to leave behind today.
It is about choosing to trust the specific, confusing wilderness you are navigating right now instead of demanding an immediate exit.
That is the ultimate challenge. And before we sign off, I want to leave you with a completely different thought to mull over. Throughout this entire text, the author uses the metaphor of a daily cup of coffee, a moment of warmth, awakening, and connection with God.
He challenges us to pour that love out to others.
But let's flip that for a second. If you are constantly tasked with pouring out these portions of love to your family, your coworkers, and your community, you have to ask yourself, what is filling your cup?
You cannot pour from an empty vessel.
Tomorrow morning, when you hold your actual cup of coffee, ask yourself not just who you are serving today, but what practices, what quiet moments, and what secret roots are you cultivating to ensure you actually have something life-giving to give away. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning your assumptions, keep shaking off the dirt, and keep finding those quiet moments to connect with the things that truly matter. We will catch you next time. If your days feel like they are just blurring together into one long, exhausting marathon, and you constantly feel like you're carrying around this mountain of invisible stress, you really aren't alone.
No, definitely not alone. It is practically the default state for most people right now.
Right. And today we are unpacking a framework designed specifically to interrupt that momentum. We are diving into the 2026 edition of the daily devotional Café Deus Pai by Junior Rostirola.
It's just such an impactful text.
It really is.
Yeah.
Now, assuming you are already familiar with the massive impact of this book series and its core premise of the intentional pause, our mission for this deep dive is slightly different today.
Yeah, we aren't just reading the daily entries.
Exactly. We are going to extract and synthesize the overarching psychological and spiritual themes that Rostirola is pushing for this specific year.
And it's a vital exercise because the architecture of this 2026 edition is incredibly deliberate.
Yeah.
Well, we aren't just looking at isolated daily readings. When you step back and look at the progression of the entries, a distinct blueprint emerges. It's a blueprint that demands you confront your past, totally recalibrate your lenses on what constitutes a successful life, endures the friction of personal maturity, and ultimately rethink the legacy you are leaving behind.
It is a heavy blueprint.
Very.
But before we trace that path through the daily entries, there's a structural element introduced right at the beginning of the book that really sets the stakes for everything that follows. I'm talking about the Atos de Amor, or the Acts of Love movement.
Right, the 5 specific challenges.
Yes, exactly. Rostirola weaves this challenge into the text 5 distinct times throughout the year. It's an explicit call to take whatever internal peace you're cultivating during your daily pause and externalize it.
through simple, tangible acts of kindness.
Yeah, it's essentially saying take your coffee moment and turn it into action.
Which is a fascinating pivot, because usually devotional reading is an entirely solitary, private consumption of comfort or wisdom. You read it, you feel better, you move on.
Right, it's very internal.
Exactly.
Right.
But by embedding these 5 specific challenges, the book essentially operates as a mobilization strategy. It takes the individual and forces them to recognize their role in the collective.
And the rationale he provides for this is so grounding. The core philosophy here is that massive, sweeping societal change doesn't always come from the top down.
No, it rarely does.
It doesn't rely solely on large institutions. It happens when ordinary people decide to intercept the default cynicism of the day. They decide they're going to be the catalyst for the change they want to see just through ordinary, everyday kindness.
It momentarily interrupts the often callous patterns of human interaction. When you perform an unexpected act of generosity, you wake people up. You pull them out of their own exhausting marathon.
I love that.
And from a developmental standpoint, this sets the stage perfectly for the heavy internal work the rest of the book demands. It establishes early on that having the love of God as your true north isn't just about your personal comfort.
Right, it's not just a cozy feeling.
It's about recognizing you are part of an ecosystem.
Okay, so let's get into that heavy internal work, because the book wastes absolutely no time in January. The entries from January 7th, 8th, and 9th, they hit like a freight train regarding the baggage we carry.
They really do. It's a very aggressive start to the year.
Obviously, you can't step into a new phase of your life if you are dragging a massive anchor behind you. But actually letting go is so much harder than it sounds.
Well, we all have a terrible habit of hoarding negative experiences.
Oh, absolutely.
We hold on to our pain, our grievances, and our past failures because, strangely, they become part of the structure of our identity. We know who we are when we are the person who was wronged.
Which is exactly what the January 7th entry titled Ole para a frente, or Look Forward, Attacks Head On. Rostirola uses the analogy of driving a car. He argues that trying to live while tied to the past is like trying to drive down the highway while staring exclusively into the rearview mirror.
It's terrifying to even picture.
It is. It is not just unproductive, it is actively dangerous. You are going to crash. But I want to push back on this a little bit, because when someone has experienced real trauma, telling them to just stop looking in the mirror can feel dismissive. How does the book navigate that tension?
That is the crucial nuance, and it's found in the highlighted phrase for that day. He says, do not have the past as a residence, but as a reference.
Resonance versus reference.
Exactly. The author isn't advocating for amnesia. Moving forward doesn't mean pretending the terrible things never happened or invalidating the pain. It's about the allocation of your focus.
So you still use the mirror?
Yes, a rear-view mirror is an essential piece of equipment in a car. You need to glance at it to understand what's behind you, to merge safely, to maintain spatial awareness. It is a reference point.
But if you live in it, if you make it your residence,
then your gaze is permanently locked on the mirror, and you miss the road ahead. You miss the turns you need to take today. Resolving trauma in the context of this framework is about acknowledging the scars with an understanding that they brought you to where you are.
Right, while ensuring your primary focus and your primary energy is directed through the windshield.
Perfectly said.
That distinction between residence and reference is incredibly practical, and he builds right on top of that the very next day. January 8th is titled Excesso de Bagagem, or excess baggage. He uses the airport luggage scale as the metaphor.
Oh, that's such a visceral image.
We all know that horrible, tense feeling of hoisting your suitcase onto the scale at the check-in counter and holding your breath to see if it's over the 50-pound limit.
It's a universally understood moment of anxiety.
Completely. And Rostirola compares our daily lives to that exact scenario. We pack our bags with our dreams and our plans, which is great. But then we start shoving in the pain, the unresolved difficulties, the deep resentments, the injustices from 5 years ago.
Just packing it all in.
And suddenly we are standing at the scale and we are way over the limit.
And at the airport, the rules are non-negotiable when you're over the limit. You have 2 choices. You either open the bag right there in public and physically remove items until you hit the limit, or you pay a massive punitive tax to keep carrying it.
Right. And the book points out that in our lives, this tax isn't financial. We pay an emotional and spiritual tax every single day. We refuse to unpack the resentment.
It drains you.
Carrying that excess baggage paralyzes you. It makes the actual journey of living so exhausting that you barely have the energy to enjoy the destination. Rostirola urges the reader to essentially conduct a radical audit of their internal suitcase.
To really look at what they're lugging around.
He says it doesn't matter how long you have carried this baggage, the imperative is to take it off your shoulders right now.
But again, let's acknowledge the friction here. Unpacking that bag is brutal work.
Oh, for sure. It's much easier to just leave it zipped up.
When you've carried anger toward a family member for a decade, or you've been carrying the shame of a failed business venture, the idea of just taking it out and leaving it on the terminal floor feels almost impossible.
Because it feels like a part of you.
It requires forgiving others and often more difficult forgiving yourself. The text reassures the reader that this audit isn't supposed to be done in isolation.
Right, you aren't doing it alone.
Exactly. Relying on the divine presence provides the actual strength required to leave those heavy items behind. The promise on the other side of that unpacking isn't just a lighter load, it is profound relief and rest for the soul.
Which brings us to January 9th, and a parable that might be the most visually striking metaphor in the early part of the book. The entry is called Sakuda, a poera, or shake off the dust. Rostirola shares an old story from the Iberian Peninsula about a donkey that falls into a deep, dry well.
It's a tough story to read at first.
It is. The donkey is old, the well is deep. And the owners look at the situation and make a purely pragmatic, deeply cruel calculation. They decide the animal isn't worth the immense effort it would take to rescue him. So they decide to bury him alive to put him out of his misery.
They just give up on him.
They grab shovels and start throwing dirt down into the well.
It's an intensely suffocating image. It captures that exact feeling of being buried by your circumstances where the people or the situations around you have just decided that you are done.
Yes, the inevitability of the dirt. You can almost feel the panic of the animal as the first few shovelfuls hit its back. But the donkey does something completely counterintuitive. Instead of letting the heavy dirt pin him to the floor of the well every time a shovelful hits his back, he shakes it off.
He refuses to stay under it.
The dirt falls to the floor, and the donkey takes a step up. He just steps on top of it. The owners are up top, sweating, throwing dirt, thinking they are creating his grave. But shovel by shovel, the dirt that was meant to bury him becomes the ramp that elevates him.
Such a powerful inversion.
Eventually, the floor of the well rises high enough that the donkey just steps right over the edge and out into the daylight.
It is a masterful reframing of adversity. Because as the text makes very clear, the dirt will come. Rostirola lists the types of dirt we all face, like harsh criticisms, professional failures, unfair judgments, unexpected medical news.
All the heavy stuff.
Sometimes the sheer volume of contrary circumstances feels like an avalanche trying to bury us.
I mean, the instinct when the dirt hits is to just lay down, to accept the burial?
Because it's exhausting. But the spiritual challenge here is an inversion of how human beings typically process pain. The book suggests that the divine invitation is to mimic the donkey. You have to shake off the dust every single day and use it as raw material for your own elevation.
He even brings in the Apostle Paul, referencing the famous verse that all things work together for the good of those who love God. But Rostirola adds this vital caveat, he says, that includes even the dirt they throw at you. God transforms the curses into blessings, the pain into growth. But it requires your active participation. You have to shake it off and step up.
Because if you let the dirt pile up, the weight of the injustice will crush you. This is the core battle between a victim mindset and a mindset of agency.
How does the book distinguish the two?
Well, a victim mindset believes that external forces dictate permanent reality. They are throwing dirt, therefore I am buried. Taking agency means saying they're throwing dirt, I will use it to build a ramp. You synthesize the painful data of your life into wisdom.
So if we manage to drop the heavy luggage at the terminal and we manage to step up out of the well using the dirt thrown at us, the obvious next question is, where are we actually walking toward? Because the book makes a pretty compelling argument that our default destination, our entire culturally defined roadmap, is usually completely wrong.
It attacks the modern cultural resume relentlessly.
Right.
We operate in a society that measures human worth almost exclusively through external materialistic metrics.
On January 10th, in an entry called Bem Sucedidos, which translates to Successful, Rostirola asks a very confrontational question. He asks, what does it mean to be successful to you? And he admits that the knee-jerk answer for most people is financial comfort, a sterling reputation, and visible merit.
It's what we are taught from childhood.
We are trained to reduce our value to our material conquests. It's this frantic, never-ending treadmill of chasing the upgraded house, the newer car, the title bump at work.
It's important to note, though, that the text isn't anti-ambition. It doesn't claim that working hard, studying, or enjoying the financial fruits of your labor is inherently evil.
Right. It's not saying you have to take a vow of poverty.
Exactly. The critique is entirely about the hierarchy of your priorities. When external markers become the ultimate goal, they displace the only things that can actually sustain the human spirit.
Rostirola poses this brilliant juxtaposition. He asks, in the midst of your packed schedule, your chaotic routine, your search for material goods, how much time have you given to those things versus the kingdom of God?
That is a tough mirror to look into.
Because the stark reality that we all desperately try to ignore is that we are not taking a single ounce of that material success with us. The corner office, the bank balance, the car, it all stays here. True success, he argues, is rooted in an intimate relationship with God the Father.
He leans on Matthew 6.33 to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. It's an argument for structural integrity.
Explain that a bit more.
If you build your life with the ultimate thing at the foundation, the secondary things can rest securely on top. But if you try to make a secondary thing like wealth or social status the foundation of your life, it will eventually crack under the pressure. A bank account was never designed to bear the load of your soul's need for profound meaning.
And shifting that foundation requires a massive adjustment in how we view the world, which he gets into deeply in May. On May 11th, the entry is Nesta as lentes, or adjust your lenses. He tackles this concept of conformism. Now, usually when we hear conformism, we think about peer pressure, like a teenager trying to fit in with the cool kids.
Right, dressing a certain way or whatever.
But Rostirola defines it differently. He defines conformism as the passive acceptance of uncomfortable, unjust, or detrimental situations.
It is settling into a permanent pessimism. It's looking at a contrary circumstance, throwing your hands up in the air and saying, well, this is just my life now.
Just accepting defeat.
It's behaving as a perpetual victim of circumstance without seeking change or victory.
And the imagery he uses to describe how we fall into this trap is so good. He says we need to stop wearing magnifying glasses to look at our problems. If you take a magnifying glass and hold it over a tiny, harmless ant, suddenly it looks like a terrifying, hairy monster.
It fills your whole field of vision.
Exactly. Rostirola argues that when we take our eyes off the divine perspective, every single minor obstacle in our path gets magnified into an absolute giant.
It comes down to the economics of your attention. Whatever you focus on expands in its psychological weight. If your mental lenses are constantly zoomed in on a critical email from your boss or a financial anxiety or relational slight, that issue will literally eclipse your entire horizon. You won't be able to see anything else.
You're just staring at the giant ant.
Adjusting your lenses means pulling the magnifying glass away so you can see the obstacle in its true right-size context.
But I can hear a listener thinking, wait, so we just ignore our problems, we just pretend the giant ant isn't there.
Not at all. Pulling the magnifying glass away doesn't make the ant disappear. It simply reveals that it is an ant, not a monster. It allows you to see that the adversity isn't a dead end, it's just a hurdle. It's an opportunity for growth and resignification rather than a reason to surrender.
He illustrates this perfectly on May 13th with a personal story in the entry, Perante os obstáculos, or facing obstacles. He talks about a time he and his family decided to hike a notoriously steep, grueling trail that passed by 12 different waterfalls.
Yeah, it sounds exhausting.
It was physically demanding. The vast majority of the people who started the trail gave up long before they reached the summit and the final waterfall.
A very apt microcosm of the human journey.
Exactly. He says he reached a point where his legs were burning, he was out of breath, and he had two choices. He could conform to the exhaustion and stop, or keep his focus locked on the ultimate goal and continue.
And he chose to continue.
He did, and the beauty of the final waterfall was worth the agony of the climb. But the spiritual lesson he draws from this is what fascinated me. He writes that many people are like the folks who quit the trail, tired, unprepared, and frustrated. But he explicitly states that the spiritual life is not a linear, obstacle-free walk in the park.
This directly challenges a very common, almost childish theological assumption that many people hold. We want to believe that if we have enough faith or if we are good enough, the divine will act as a cosmic snowplow, just clearing all the obstacles out of our path so we can walk easily.
Just a smooth, paved road all the way.
Right. But the text is definitive. It says God does not remove the obstacles from our path, but he empowers us to overcome them.
That is such a critical distinction. God doesn't airlift you to the top of the mountain. He expects you to climb it, but he provides the strength to keep your legs moving.
Because faith isn't a cheat code to bypass the difficult parts of the human experience. It isn't a magic wand that erases crises. Faith is the lens that allows you to see the purpose in the climb. When you adjust your lenses away from the burning in your lungs and focus on the destination, you trust that the effort of the climb is actually renewing and strengthening you.
The climb is changing you, which is a perfect segue because accepting that the journey is going to be difficult leads to one of the most profound recurring themes in the entire 365-day journey. The book makes it abundantly clear that you cannot escape the painful crucible of the process.
The process is everything. We live in a society built entirely on instant gratification. We want next-day delivery on our online orders, and we want next-day delivery on our character development.
We really do. We want the maturity without the time.
We want the wisdom and gravitas of a seasoned elder, but we want it with the effort and time commitment of a weekend seminar. The universe simply rejects that timeline.
On August 30th, the entry A Importancia do Processo, or the importance of the process, really drills into this. Rostirola points out that everyone has beautiful dreams, ambitious goals, their own personal version of the promised land. But universally, we want the promise without the preparation. We want to skip the line.
We want the harvest, but we despise the planting, the weeding, and the long, silent months of waiting.
He uses massive historical and biblical figures to prove that no one gets to skip the process. He points to Joseph. Joseph had dreams of being a great leader, but the reality of his process involved being betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused of a crime, and left to rot in a dark, forgotten prison.
That is a brutal preparation phase.
Or look at King David. He is literally anointed to be king, but before he ever sees the inside of a palace, he spends years in the isolation of a shepherd's field, dealing with family rejection, and then spends years literally hiding in caves, running for his life from a madman. Even Jesus had to endure the agonizing process of the cross to fulfill the ultimate plan.
The analytical takeaway here is that the delay, the waiting period, and even the humiliation aren't detours from your destiny. They are the absolute prerequisites for it.
It's reframing the delay.
Every single closed door, every relational failure, every tear you shed is actively expanding your capacity to hold what is being prepared for you. The author asks a very pointed question. Are you preparing yourself?
Because what happens if you aren't prepared?
Well, it is an act of divine mercy not to hand you a massive responsibility or blessing if your character lacks the structural integrity to sustain it. If you bypass the discipline of the weight, you might achieve the position, but the weight of it will crush you.
And that idea of structural integrity ties beautifully into the August 6th entry titled Lapidados. This translates to being cut or polished, specifically like a precious stone. Rostirola attacks the misconception that just getting older automatically makes you more mature. For generations, people equated gray hair with wisdom, but we all know that merely surviving another lap around the sun doesn't guarantee maturity.
Maturity is not passively inherited. It is an active, multifaceted conquest, psychological, relational, intellectual, and spiritual. Nobody can hand it to you. You have to develop it. And the mechanism for that development is usually immense friction.
The metaphor of being lapidados is so evocative. Imagine a rough, uncut gemstone pulled out of the earth. It is covered in dirt. It has sharp, jagged, asymmetrical edges. To reveal the brilliant, valuable jewel inside that stone cannot just be washed gently. It has to be pressed hard against a grinding wheel. It has to endure violent friction. It must be cut.
And friction generates intense heat. It is deeply uncomfortable. When we are forced through periods of intense testing, a financial crisis, a severe health scare, a painful breakup, it feels exactly like being ground down against a wheel.
It hurts.
But the text posits that this is the divine architect at work, intentionally grinding away the sharp edges of our ego, our pride, and our self-reliance. If you panic and jump off the grinding wheel the second it gets hot, you avoid the pain, but you remain a rough, dirt-covered stone forever.
Which brings us to an entry on May 12th that completely wrecked me. It's titled Confie or Trust. It contains arguably the most relatable, heartbreaking, and ultimately profound metaphor in the book. Rostirola shares a very personal memory from when his son was a tiny infant. He had to take his baby boy to the clinic to get a standard necessary injection.
Anyone who is a parent or has ever taken a baby to a doctor feels the immediate dread of this scenario.
Exactly. He describes holding his little boy securely in his arms. The baby is calm, feeling safe. Then the nurse approaches with the needle. The moment the needle pierces the skin, the child erupts into screams. And Rostirola describes how his son looked up at him through tears with this expression of utter betrayal.
Oh, that look.
The child's eyes were essentially screaming, "Dad, why are you letting this happen to me? Why aren't you saving me?" The baby felt completely abandoned by the person who was supposed to protect him.
It is a devastating emotional snapshot. But how he bridges that to our spiritual psychology is brilliant.
He writes, "I didn't save him from that situation because I knew how necessary that pain was for his long-term health. The infant lacks the cognitive development to understand the concept of immunology or disease prevention or long-term wellness. The only reality the infant understands is the acute, immediate pain of the needle."
And here is the synthesis. When it comes to the grand timeline of the universe, we are the screaming infant.
Wow, yes.
When we face a sudden, inexplicable loss or a shocking medical diagnosis or catastrophic career failure, our immediate reaction is to look up at the divine and scream, "Why are you letting this happen to me? Why aren't you saving me?" We feel a profound sense of betrayal. But the text argues that our cognitive capacity to understand the eternal timeline is just as limited as that infant's understanding of immunology. We are incapable of seeing the full picture.
The challenge Rostirola issues is that we don't always need to understand the intricate details of the plan. He writes, "We don't need to understand the divine plan in detail. We must, however, have courage, goodwill, honor, faith, disposition, and love to make the decision to obey. The requirement isn't comprehension. The requirement is trusting the parent administering the process."
It requires a total surrender of the illusion of control. We desperately want to believe we know what is best for our lives. But just like that father holding his crying son, a divine no, or a period of intense waiting, or a season of pain, isn't a denial of love. It's an act of deep, far-sighted protection and preparation.
The book is basically asking us to look at our holding patterns or our frustrations and consider if we are fighting the polishing process or are we trying to jump off the grinding wheel. But once you begin to actually trust that internal process, once you accept the wheel, you can't just sit there forever. The book eventually demands that you translate that internal trust into external action.
Right. Faith and maturity, according to Rostirola's framework, cannot remain purely theoretical. They cannot be confined to your private journal entries. They require real-world execution.
And so we look at how the book redefines the mechanisms of action, starting with how we view courage. On May 20th, the entry is simply couragem. Usually when society talks about courage, we picture a superhero or an elite soldier. We define it as the total absence of fear.
Which is a completely useless definition for normal human psychology. If courage requires not feeling afraid, then none of us will ever be courageous, because fear is an involuntary neurological response to risk.
Rostirola breaks it down so beautifully. He explicitly states courage is not the absence of fear. He defines it as the capacity to face fears and adversities. It is the refusal to let fear be the dictating force that paralyzes you. Courage is simply taking one step forward to do what needs to be done, even while your knees are literally knocking together.
It's about not letting fear have the final veto over your actions. He points to the heavyweights of the biblical text, Joshua, Esther, David, Paul. Every single one of them faced terrifying opposition. They undoubtedly felt immense fear. But courage is what you do in the presence of the fear. The text reassures the reader that the divine isn't demanding shimmer. You never feel afraid. The demand is that you don't let the fear freeze you in place.
And to help generate that forward movement, 2 days later, on May 22nd, he provides a very specific 3-step formula for realizing promises. The entry is Crea, obedece, espera, or believe, obey, and wait. He dismantles the idea that promises just magically fall into your lap while you sit on the couch.
The 3 steps are incredibly practical but challenging. Step 1 is belief. This isn't passive wishing. It's an internal foundational alignment. If your heart is entirely consumed by doubt and cynicism, you literally lack the navigational equipment to reach the destination.
Then comes step 2, which is the hardest. Obey. Rostirola notes that almost every divine promise comes with conditions that require stepping totally out of your comfort zone. He uses the example of Abraham having to physically leave his homeland and everything he knew. Obedience isn't just nodding in agreement, it is taking kinetic action based on your beliefs, especially when it is deeply inconvenient or risky.
And step 3 is wait. But the book totally deconstructs how we normally view waiting. We usually think of waiting as sitting in a doctor's office reading a magazine, just doing nothing until your name is called. Rostirola frames waiting as active perseverance. He says you must fortify yourself in faith and maintain communion while you wait. The waiting period is the active construction site of your character.
But here's where the book really surprised me. You have the courage, you are following the steps you're awaiting actively, but who does God usually pick to actually do the world-changing work? On August 4th and 5th, the entries, Deus usa os improváveis, God uses the unlikely, and portadores da luz, bearers of light, completely flip our modern assumptions about leadership and influence upside down.
We live in an era of the influencer. We assume that to be a messenger for truth or to enact real change, you need a massive social media following immense wealth, eloquence, and a highly visible platform.
But Rostirola points out that the divine methodology almost always bypasses the elite and selects the unlikely, the humble, and the marginalized. He uses the story of Naaman. Naaman was a prominent, terrifyingly powerful Syrian military commander who contracted leprosy. He had access to the greatest doctors, kings, and wealth of his era. But none of his elite connections could heal him. Who was the messenger that actually pointed him toward his salvation?
It wasn't someone powerful.
No, it was a nameless young captive servant girl working in his own household. She was the one who bravely spoke up and told his wife about the prophet in Israel.
The power dynamics in that story are wild. The most vulnerable, unseen person in the entire social hierarchy held the absolute key to the powerful commander's survival. The text uses this to challenge the reader. Do not ignore the voices of the humble. Stop looking exclusively to the top of the pyramid for wisdom, because God constantly places unlikely, seemingly unimportant messengers directly in our path.
And he expands on this idea of influence on August 5th, talking about what it actually means to be bearers of light. He says that being the salt of the earth and the light of the world is not about impressing people. That is a quote. It is not about impressing, but about transforming. You don't need a corner office or a microphone to pull up a chair and listen to someone who is hurting.
It is a sharp critique of our performative culture. We love the aesthetics of goodness. But real influence requires immense resilience. The text compares exercising influence to building a muscle. It only grows stronger by being put under tension. If you decide to be a light, you are going to attract wind that tries to blow you out. You will face opposition, judgments, and slander.
Which makes the entry from August 3rd, titled Em Secreto, in secret, one of the most vital warnings in the entire year. Rostirola comes out swinging against living a life of spiritual disguise. He warns against the person who prays loudly in public, using complex, impressive vocabulary just to be seen as holy, while their actual private life is devoid of intimacy or grace. He asks, what good is all this, however, without good intentions?
It is a devastating diagnosis of spiritual narcissism, using the trappings of faith as a theatrical costume to farm applause from other humans. The book insists that the true, unshakable core of a human being is only developed in absolute secrecy.
He references the concept from Banning Liebscher's book Rooted, pointing out that God develops our roots in quiet, intimate encounters. If a tree wants to produce abundant fruit that everyone can see, the roots have to go incredibly deep into the dark earth where absolutely nobody is watching. Nobody claps for roots.
But the psychological stability that provides is unmatched. If your entire identity and sense of goodness are built on external validation on how many likes your good deed got you, are incredibly fragile. One harsh critique will shatter your entire foundation. But if you do the grueling, unglamorous work in secret, your roots become unshakable. It prevents your own ego from hijacking your spiritual journey.
He explicitly says to cultivate that secret relationship so that later your fruits are known even when nobody knows the roots.
It's challenging, because it requires stripping away our need for an audience. But doing that deep-rooted work is precisely what prepares us to face the final and perhaps most intense theme of the book. As you progress through the months, the book forces you to confront the ultimate, unavoidable reality that the clock is ticking and time is running out.
It brings this sharp existential awareness right to the forefront. Realizing the finite nature of our existence is perhaps the ultimate clarifying mechanism for figuring out what actually matters. In June specifically, the 9th and 12th, the entries A brevidad da vida, the brevity of life and o que realmente importa. What really matters deliver a very sobering wake-up call. Rostirola quotes the biblical book of James, reminding the reader that human life is literally just a mist. It appears for a little while, hangs in the air, and then vanishes.
It's an ancient concept, remembering the inevitability of our own end. But he doesn't use it to create morbid fear. He uses it to create awakening.
He observes how our perception of time shifts. When we are children, a single summer feels like an entire lifetime. But as adults, when our minds are cluttered with task bills and exhausting routines, the years evaporate. He writes, when we realize that life has passed, the children have grown, loved ones are gone in short time, is relentless.
And internalizing that brevity is the only thing that gives us permission to stop living performatively. The text argues that when you truly comprehend how short the mist lasts, you naturally stop caring so much about satisfying the opinions of people who don't actually know you. You stop being paralyzed by the fear of not being accepted by the crowd.
Rostirola gives a very explicit command. Take your foot off the accelerator. Take your foot off the gas pedal of your frantic routine and learn to value what actually remains. He writes this incredibly piercing, clarifying line. What will make a difference in the end is not the quantity of goods you accumulated or how much money is in your bank account, but how much you loved and enjoyed the company of those you love.
It forces the reader to shift their focus from the skills they bring to the marketplace to the qualities they bring to their relationships. When the mist clears, the only metrics that survive are kindness, honesty, and the capacity for deep love.
Which leads right into the haunting question he poses on May 17th. ¿Cuál será o seu legado? What will be your legacy? He reminds the reader that our daily actions don't just stay in the present. He writes, we will all, no matter the level of influence, leave a legacy, whether for the good we did in the present echoing into the future or the way we related to people.
Every single interaction produces fruit for eternity, whether it is bitter or sweet. It frames every ordinary day as an act of immense responsibility, but also immense privilege.
And all of this intense psychological and spiritual excavation, the unpacking of the luggage, the adjusting of the lenses to right-size the ants, the agonizing friction of the grinding wheel, the secret work in the dark, the confrontation with the mist of time, it all culminates perfectly on the very last day of the year. December 31st. The entry is titled, Obrigado Deus Pai, Thank You God the Father.
It is the architectural capstone of the entire 365-day journey.
Before you are allowed to make a single resolution or plan for the new year, the book demands a full stop, a moment of pure, unadulterated gratitude. But it isn't just a shallow thanks for the good stuff. Rostirola writes gratitude for everything we live, for all the visible blessings, and also for those that went unnoticed, for the strength in difficult moments, for the comfort in the loss of loved ones.
That is the brilliance of this final instruction. He specifically instructs the reader to be thankful for the unseen deliverances. We never think about the disasters we narrowly avoided. He is asking the reader to be grateful for the times God forcefully closed a door that we were desperately trying to kick open because walking through it would have been our ruin. He asks us to be grateful for the quiet comfort provided during invisible losses that nobody else even knew we suffered.
The text explains the mechanics of why this is necessary. Gratitude transforms our heart. It takes the focus off what we lack and values what stayed.
Look at the psychological loop this entire book creates. It starts in early January by telling you to shake off the dust of the well and drop your heavy, resentful baggage at the airport. It spends the whole year breaking down your ego, teaching you to trust the painful injection of the process and pushing you to act with courage in secret. And it ends in December by taking your empty, calloused hands and filling them with total gratitude. Gratitude is presented as a transformational technology. It permanently rewires your brain to constantly scan for the presence of the divine rather than agonizing over the chaos and lack in the world.
And as Rostirola suggests, the goal is to let your very last prayer of the year be a simple thank you.
It is a staggering, comprehensive behavioral and spiritual framework.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We traced the entire architecture of the 2026 journey. We started with the sheer necessity of making a daily choice to pause, to intersect the cynical momentum of society with simple acts of love. We talked about how absolutely critical it is to open your suitcase, face the music, and shed the baggage of the past so you stop paying that heavy emotional tax.
We analyzed the cultural illusion of the material resume and why we have to remove the magnifying glass from our anxieties so we can see obstacles as opportunities for the climb rather than monsters.
We looked deeply at the painful, beautiful grinding wheel of the process, how being lapidados, cut and polished like rough stones hurts, but it is the only way maturity is ever formed. We explored why we have to trust the parent holding us during the terrifying injection. We redefined courage not as the absence of fear, but as stepping forward while the fear is present, doing the hard, unglamorous work in secret where the roots grow deep.
And we confronted the mist of our own mortality, realizing that taking our foot off the gas to genuinely love our people is the only way to build a legacy that echoes into eternity, sealing the entire year in radical gratitude for the unseen protections.
It is a profound blueprint. And as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to bring the challenge directly to you. The entire premise of Rostirola's work is action. So your challenge today is to actually carve out your own intentional pause. I don't care how chaotic your schedule is right now. Find 10 minutes. Find that quiet space. Mentally drop the magnifying glass you are currently holding over whatever anxiety is eating at you today. Adjust your lenses. Ask yourself what heavy item is in your suitcase that you need to leave behind right now.
And as you reflect on that, there is one final provocative thought to mull over, circling back to the donkey in the well. The text highlights the donkey using the dirt to build a ramp out of the darkness. But consider the people who were standing at the top of the well throwing the dirt down. They were acting out of cruel pragmatism or sheer indifference. They fully believed they were burying the donkey. They thought they were ending its story. But in reality, they were supplying the exact specific raw material needed for the donkey's elevation.
So here is the question for you to explore on your own today. What if the people or the circumstances or the seemingly unfair, crushing situations that are currently causing your greatest distress, what if they are unknowingly handing you the exact tools you need to rise to a level of maturity, empathy, and strength that you could never, ever have reached on your own? Keep stepping up. We'll see you next time.
Welcome in. It is so good to have you here with us today for this deep dive.
Yeah, really glad you're joining us.
I want you to just take a second and imagine something for me. Have you ever felt like you're just, walking around carrying this invisible backpack?
Oh, man, the invisible backpack.
Right. And it's like every few years, you just toss another brick into it.
Just casually adding another brick.
Exactly. And you're exhausted. You're constantly mapping out every possible worst-case scenario for tomorrow.
The whole what-if spiral.
The exact spiral. And on top of that, you're still dragging around the emotional weight of, mistakes you made a decade ago.
It's a heavy way to live.
It really is. So if that resonates with you, and honestly, if you're human, it resonates at least a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone feels that way.
Then the journey we are taking you on today is going to be incredibly relevant. Today's deep dive is a really special one. We are unpacking this massive, highly influential daily text.
Yeah, it's called Café com Deus Pai 2026.
Which translates to Coffee with God the Father 2026.
Exactly. Written by Junior Rostirola. And I think it's crucial we set the stage for you right away regarding, what kind of source material we're actually looking at here.
Yeah, give us the context.
So on the surface, the framework is explicitly a Christian daily devotional. It's structured to give the reader 1 page a day, 365 days a year.
One for every day.
Right. But our approach today is to kind of take a step back and examine the broader tapestry here, because it's incredibly rich with psychological insights, striking metaphors, and really fiercely practical life advice that the author has woven throughout the entire year.
And that is exactly our mission for today. We aren't here to, preach at you or hand you a dense theological textbook.
No, definitely not.
We are here to extract these universal nuggets of wisdom. Things about resilience, about the paralyzing nature of modern anxiety, and about the deep and sometimes really baffling quirks of human nature.
Baffling is the perfect word for it.
What makes this text so compelling is how it uses these brilliant everyday metaphors to guide the reader through a complete mindset shift.
It's all about shifting the perspective.
Yeah, we want to figure out how to stop being bogged down by the ghosts of our past.
Yeah.
How to stop spiraling about those what-ifs of our future.
And how to actually find some profound, grounded meaning in the messy present, which is where we actually live.
Right, and the mechanism the text uses to achieve this is it's largely narrative.
Which is so smart. It strips away all that high-level abstract philosophy. It grounds these massive existential life concepts in deeply relatable imagery.
Because if we look at how human beings actually process and retain information...
I don't remember abstract rules.
We really don't. We don't remember a list of 10 things to do to be happier.
We remember stories. We remember analogies that map perfectly onto our daily struggles. It provides a framework you can actually visualize when you are stressed out.
And the visual analogies we have lined up to explore with you today are just fantastic.
They really hit home.
Just to give you a sense of where we're heading, we're going to talk about why your emotional baggage is functioning exactly like over-the-limit airline luggage.
That one is so visceral.
We are going to look at a genuinely surprising, counterintuitive lesson from an old donkey trapped at the bottom of a dry well.
One of my favorites.
And later on, we're going to discuss the deeply moving meaning behind a simple knot tied in a child's bedsheet. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, get comfortable.
Yeah, settle in. To really get into the foundation of this text, we have to start with the concept of weight. The sheer, invisible weight we carry as humans.
The backpack with the bricks.
Exactly. The author tackles this head-on very early in the year. He addresses our profoundly complicated, often paralyzing relationship with our past, which, you'll notice, is almost always coupled with an intense, buzzing anxiety about our future.
The entry for January 7th introduces this so perfectly. There's this powerful analogy of trying to drive a car while staring exclusively into the rearview mirror.
It's a terrifying image if you really think about it.
It is. Imagine you are on a highway doing 65 miles an hour, surrounded by other cars, but you flat out refuse to look through the windshield.
You're just totally focused on what's behind you.
Your eyes are completely locked on that little mirror showing you the road you've already passed, the exits you missed, the potholes you already hit.
It's a terrible way to drive, but it is such a stark representation of how a lot of us actually live our lives.
Because a crash is literally inevitable at that point.
It is, and psychologically speaking, this is a highly accurate representation of rumination.
Let's unpack rumination for a second.
Sure. Rumination is when our brains get stuck on a loop. You are constantly replaying past events, past traumas, unresolved conflicts, or even past glories that we just can't seem to let go of.
The glory days trap.
Exactly. The author argues that living tethered to these things is not just unproductive, it's actively dangerous to your present reality.
There's a specific phrase he uses, right?
Yeah, in Portuguese it's viver preso ao que passou é como tentar dirigir carro olhando apenas para o retrovisor. Driving while looking back. And the core takeaway offered here is essential. The past should be a reference, not a residence.
Ah, I love that phrasing so much. A reference, not a residence.
Oh, it's brilliant.
But, okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Yeah.
Because it's super easy to say don't live in the past. But what if the past holds incredibly important lessons?
Or good memories, sure.
Right. What if it holds beautiful, nostalgic memories of a time when things were simpler or people who are no longer with us were still here? It feels unnatural to just never look back.
That is a very fair point, and it's exactly why the word reference is doing so much heavy lifting in that quote. The text isn't advocating for amnesia here.
Right. You don't rip the rearview mirror off the windshield.
Exactly. You look in the rearview mirror occasionally to safely change lanes, right?
Yeah.
You look in it to see how far you've come, or to avoid backing into a brick wall.
You reference it.
You reference it. The psychological danger arises when the emotional center of your life is located in a time zone that no longer exists.
A time zone that no longer exists. Wow.
If you are residing in a past failure, you are operating from a place of chronic shame. If you are residing in a past success, you are likely operating from a place of entitlement or stagnation. You're wondering why the world isn't still rewarding you for something you did 5 years ago.
That distinction makes a lot of sense. The text talks about looking at our scars with gratitude rather than shame or lament. It suggests we have to let whatever hurt us become the seeds for a new beginning.
Which is easier said than done.
Oh, totally. The sheer mechanics of doing that are really tough. Which leads us perfectly into another metaphor introduced just a day later, on January 8th, the airline baggage limit.
Now, this is an analogy that I think everyone listening can feel on a purely visceral level.
Visceral is the word. Just thinking about the check-in counter at the airport gives me a mild stress response.
Your blood pressure just goes up a little bit.
You know exactly the feeling. You lug this massive overstuffed suitcase onto the scale. You hold your breath as those digital numbers tick up.
And then it flashes red.
It flashes red. You are over the limit. And the airline agent just looks at you, and suddenly you are faced with exactly two choices.
Neither of which are fun.
No, you either have to pop that bag open right there on the floor in front of everyone and publicly leave something behind.
Or you pull out your wallet and pay a massive, exorbitant tax to carry that extra weight with you.
It is the perfect modern metaphor for emotional burden. The text applies this directly to our internal lives.
We all carry a suitcase through life. Inside, yes, we have our dreams, our plans, our core values. But shoved away into the corners are our pains, our grudges, our resentments, our unresolved guilt.
Heavy stuff.
And when that baggage becomes too heavy, it literally paralyzes our forward momentum. Carrying a grudge against someone who wronged you incurs a heavy emotional tax.
And it's a tax you pay every single day.
Exactly. You pay for it with your peace of mind. You pay for it with elevated cortisol levels, which actively impacts your physical health.
You're literally paying with your body.
You are. And you pay for it with your ability to be present in your current relationships because you are so exhausted from carrying the luggage of the past ones. The author challenges the reader to literally open up their emotional suitcase and audit it item by item.
But okay, again, let's ground this in reality. It's one thing to say, is that grudge against my former boss worth the daily tax? The logical answer is no.
Right. Easy call.
But if someone has deeply, profoundly betrayed you, like a partner, a family member, a close friend, You can't just check that bag at the gate and merrily walk onto your flight.
This doesn't work like that.
How does this text, or even psychology in general, suggest we actually handle the logistics of that kind of deep forgiveness? It can't be as simple as leaving a heavy sweater at the counter.
You're absolutely right, and it's really important not to trivialize deep betrayal. Forgiveness, in the context we're discussing here, is rarely a one-time, simple decision.
It's not a light switch.
No, it is an ongoing cognitive shift. When the text talks about getting rid of the extra weight, it isn't saying the betrayal didn't happen or that it didn't matter. Psychologically, dropping the baggage means separating the historical event from the ongoing emotional debt you are forcing yourself to collect.
Oh, that's interesting, the emotional debt.
Yeah, if you hold a deep grudge, you are essentially drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die.
That old saying, yeah.
Dropping the baggage means you stop expecting the person who broke you to be the one who fixes you.
Wow. Let me just repeat that for the listener. You stop expecting the person who broke you to fix you.
It is a terrifying level of agency to assume, but it is the only way to stop paying that daily tax. You acknowledge the item is in your bag, you acknowledge it's heavy, and you consciously decide, I cannot take this onto the next phase of my journey if I want to actually get off the ground.
That reframing is incredibly powerful. So if the past is this heavy luggage we are dragging around, the future represents an entirely different kind of trap in this text. It's the terrain of the what-ifs.
Yes. The text discusses the tyranny of anxiety quite extensively, particularly if you look at the entries from May 15th and August 29th.
The ISIS.
Exactly. In Portuguese, the phrase the author highlights is "e se," what if? What if everything goes wrong? What if the economy crashes? What if people abandon me? What if I'm not successful?
The brain just spirals.
Because the brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. Its job is to keep us safe by anticipating threats.
He's trying to help.
It is trying to help, but the author points out that in states of high anxiety, the brain stops being a helpful scout and actually acts as an internal enemy. It constantly formulates these ruinous possibilities, attempting to control a tomorrow that is, by its very nature, fundamentally uncontrollable.
What I deeply appreciate about this source material is that the author doesn't just analyze this from some detached clinical perspective. He gets incredibly vulnerable with the reader.
The August 31st entry.
Yes. On August 31st, Junior Rostirola shares a personal anecdote that just completely humanizes the concept. He describes growing up as a very sad, introspective child.
He carried this really heavy sadness.
A silent, heavy sadness, and a fear of the dark. But it wasn't just your standard monster-under-the-bed childhood fear. He describes a pervasive fear of his own insufficiency.
Which is so heartbreaking for a kid.
It is. A fear of authority figures like the police, a fear of going to school, and paradoxically, a fear of staying home. He says this shadow followed him everywhere, and as he got older, it crystallized and gained a formal name: anxiety.
That vulnerability is crucial because it validates the lived experience of the reader. Anxiety is frequently misunderstood as a lack of willpower or a character flaw.
Like you're just not trying hard enough to be calm.
Exactly. But Rostirola's description highlights it as an overwhelming systemic fear. The text provides a definition of anxiety that is quite profound. It describes it as the mind wanting to run ahead of time and the soul trying to carry the tomorrow with the forces we have today.
Trying to carry the tomorrow with the forces we have today. That hits hard. Because you only have today's strength, today's resources, today's energy.
And that's all you have.
But you're trying to lift tomorrow's entirely hypothetical problems. It's a mathematical impossibility. Which is exactly why our nervous systems just crash. We burn out trying to solve puzzles that haven't even been fully drawn yet.
Precisely. The cognitive load is completely unsustainable. So the solution the book offers is a massive shift in how we perceive peace.
How do we usually define peace?
Culturally, we define peace as the absence of problems. We think peace is sitting on a quiet beach with a frozen drink and 0 emails in our inbox.
That sounds pretty peaceful to me.
Right, it sounds great. But the text argues that true peace is not the absence of storms. It is a grounded certainty and trust in the midst of them.
Ah, so it's internal, not external.
Exactly. In the theological context of the book, that certainty is rooted in trust in God the Father. But the psychological application for anyone listening right now is about actively letting go of the illusion of control.
Because we don't actually control much.
Almost nothing. You cannot control the macroeconomic environment, you cannot control other people's opinions, and you cannot control the future. Peace is the internal boundary you set that says, I will handle what is in front of me today, and I release my grip on the rest.
Okay, so if we accept that premise, If we accept that we have to drop the heavy bags of our past and we have to release our white-knuckled grip on the what-ifs of the future, it naturally begs a massive question.
How do we handle right now?
Yes, how do we handle the friction of the present? We are still here, right now, dealing with the daily grind. And the text has a really fascinating, quite challenging take on our modern obsession with instant gratification.
It does, and this brings us into a major thematic block of the book, reevaluating the journey, or what the author frequently refers to simply as the process.
Nobody likes the process.
Nobody likes it because we live in a society that is structurally engineered for instant results.
Next day delivery.
Next day delivery, instant streaming, fast food, swipe right relationships. We have been completely conditioned to expect the reward without having to endure the friction of the work.
We want the shortcut.
Always. But this text places a deep, unavoidable emphasis on endurance, on the necessity of facing obstacles, and on being what it calls polished.
Let's dig into the entry from May 11th, which is titled Adjusting the Lenses. The author warns against conformity and the trap of playing the victim. He uses this really great metaphor of a magnifying glass.
This is such a common trap.
When we face problems, our instinct is to hold up a magnifying glass to them. We zoom in so incredibly close that the obstacle becomes the only thing in our field of vision. It eclipses our relationships, our gratitude, our perspective. It just becomes the whole world.
It's a very common cognitive distortion. If we connect this to the broader psychological picture, it's about the concept of framing.
Framing, yeah.
How you frame an event largely determines your emotional and physiological response to it. If you look at a problem through a magnifying glass, your brain registers it as a massive, insurmountable threat.
It triggers the panic response.
Exactly. The text suggests we have to put down the magnifying glass and instead adjust our lenses, use a wide-angle lens, so to speak, to see these adversities not as dead ends, but as opportunities for growth, maturation, and resignification.
Okay, let's pause on that word. Resignification. It's a bit of a heavy term.
It is. Let's break it down.
For anyone listening who isn't familiar with the clinical jargon, let's unpack that. Resignification is basically taking an event or a memory that currently has a negative meaning attached to it, like, I failed that business venture, therefore I am a failure, and actively rewriting its meaning.
You change the significance.
Right, so it becomes, I failed that business venture, which means I now possess a highly expensive real-world education in what not to do next time. You aren't changing the facts, you are changing the meaning of the facts.
That is a perfect explanation. And the text takes this idea of resignification further by introducing the concept of the desert and the promised land, which is heavily featured in the entries for August 24th and 30th.
The desert.
This is where the book addresses our deep desire to skip the hard parts.
Oh, this is such a huge theme. The text acknowledges this very human desire to just teleport straight to the finish line. We want our situation transformed overnight. We want the promotion, the healed marriage, the financial stability, the deep wisdom, and we want it right now.
With a snap of the fingers.
But the author points to major historical and biblical figures to prove a point. He talks about Abraham, Joseph, Moses, David. Every single one of them was given a grand promise or had a massive destiny, but absolutely none of them got it overnight.
Not a single one.
They all had to pass through a long, often torturous, incredibly boring period of waiting. They all had to go through the desert.
The analysis of the process here is vital. The modern interpretation of a hard time, a desert period, is that we are being punished or that we have somehow completely derailed our lives.
Like we made a wrong turn somewhere.
Right. But the text argues that the desert isn't a punishment. It is a required incubation chamber.
Incubation chamber. I like that.
Take the example of David. Before he was ever recognized as a king, he was a shepherd. He had to deal with the rejection of being overlooked by his own family. He had to spend years tending sheep in complete obscurity in the wilderness, facing predators entirely alone.
Doing the unglamorous work.
Exactly. The author argues that handling rejection, dealing with isolation, and doing that repetitive work in the shadows is the exact preparation required to handle the immense pressure and scrutiny of the throne later on.
That is such a crucial reframe for you listening. If you skip the desert, you might get the reward, but you won't have the structural integrity to hold on to it.
Exactly. If you bypass the process, you lack the character to sustain the promise. You see this in the real world all the time with lottery winners or people who achieve sudden viral fame.
Well, viral fame is a great example.
Without the slow, grueling process of building character and financial literacy, the sudden influx of wealth or attention often destroys them.
To illustrate this idea of pushing through the grueling process, the author shares a brilliant personal story from May 13th.
The 12 waterfalls.
Yes. He talks about a time he and his family decided to hike a trail that featured 12 consecutive waterfalls. It was a steep, incredibly difficult climb. And as they are making their way up, he notices something fascinating about human behavior.
What do they do?
He sees that the vast majority of the people on the trail, exhausted, panting, legs burning, are giving up and turning around. And they're quitting right before reaching the final 12th waterfall at the very top of the mountain.
It's a striking anecdote. It speaks perfectly to the psychology of perceived exertion versus actual capacity.
Perceived versus actual.
Yes, our brains will tell us we are at our absolute limit long before our bodies actually are. The author decides to push through the pain, he manages his mind, and he makes it to the 12th waterfall, which is, of course, the most breathtakingly beautiful of them all.
Of course it is.
He uses this physical hike to extrapolate a critical life lesson. Our personal and spiritual journeys are not linear, smooth events. They are fraught with steep climbs, deep fatigue, and moments where we just want to quit. But these challenges are not designed to stop us. They are designed to expand our capacity to overcome.
He writes this really profound line. God does not remove the obstacles from our path, but he enables us to overcome them.
Which completely shifts the expectation.
It does. If he had quit at Waterfall 11, he wouldn't have just missed a pretty view. He would have missed the essential lesson about his own endurance. He would have gone home believing his limit was lower than it actually was.
He would have settled for a false limit.
And this ties beautifully into the concept of polishing the stone from the August 6th entry. The author references a friend of his, Luciano Subirá, who wrote extensively on the concept of maturity. And the core premise is brilliantly simple. Aging is completely inevitable. You literally just have to stay alive and time will do the rest. But maturity is a difficult, arduous conquest.
It truly is. No one can transfer their maturity to you. You cannot inherit it, you cannot download it, and you cannot buy it.
You have to earn it.
The text delves into the metaphor of a rough stone. We all start out as unpolished, rough rocks with jagged edges. True maturity requires consciously submitting yourself to a painful polishing process.
And polishing means friction.
By definition, it involves abrasives. In life, that friction comes in the form of trials, interpersonal conflicts, failures, and tribulations. It is only through the continuous abrasive action of this process that the jewel hidden underneath the rough exterior is finally revealed.
It reminds me of the classic diamond formed under pressure idea, but it feels much more active here.
How so?
Because a piece of coal doesn't have a choice in becoming a diamond. But a human being has to actively choose not to jump off the polishing wheel when it gets uncomfortable.
Right, you can always tap out.
When you get harsh feedback at work, you can either jump off the wheel and blame your boss, or you can endure the friction, take the feedback, and get polished.
That's a great practical application.
And speaking of incredible metaphors for dealing with harsh input, we absolutely have to talk about the catalytic converter from August 26.
Yes, this is perhaps one of the most innovative modern metaphors in the entire source material.
It's so unexpected.
The author discusses the ancient biblical story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a cupbearer to a king, living a relatively comfortable life when he receives devastating, deeply depressing news that the walls of his ancestral city, Jerusalem, are in ruins.
Just a total gut punch.
But instead of just wallowing in despair or becoming cynical, Nehemiah takes the raw emotion of that sadness and uses it as the impetus to go back and physically rebuild the city.
Right. And the author compares Nehemiah's internal process to a catalytic converter in a vehicle. Now, I am by no means a mechanic, but the book explains the basic function clearly.
It's basically an emissions control device.
Exactly. A catalytic converter takes the toxic, harmful gases produced by the engine's combustion, and through a chemical reaction, it transforms those toxic gases into relatively harmless substances before they leave the exhaust pipe and enter the atmosphere.
It cleans the exhaust.
The author challenges the reader to become the catalysts of their own generation. When we absorb toxic input, devastating news, deep sadness, a humiliating situation, or harsh criticism, our default human setting is to just emit that toxicity right back into the world.
Hurt people, right?
Exactly. That's the default.
And the psychological resilience being asked of the reader here is profound. It's about taking the raw material of your pain, the toxic exhaust of life, and creating an internal mechanism to process it.
But for anyone listening, how do you actually do this?
It requires a massive cognitive shift. When you receive toxic criticism, instead of internalizing it as a flaw in your identity, you categorize it as data. You allow yourself to feel the emotional sting, but then you isolate the constructive part of that data and you use it to improve.
You filter it.
The text says Nehemiah didn't stay paralyzed by the bad news. He transformed his mourning into courage. It is an active, intentional transformation of suffering into purpose. You refuse to let the toxicity pass through you unchanged.
So to recap this segment for everyone listening, because there is a lot of actionable material here, don't hold a magnifying glass up to your problems and lose the big picture.
Keep the wide-angle lens.
Don't try to frantically skip the desert phase of your life, because that is exactly where you are getting the training you need for your next level.
Trust the incubation chamber.
Don't quit at waterfall 11 when your brain tells you you're done.
Yeah.
Actively choose to endure the friction of being polished. And most importantly, build an internal catalytic converter so you can turn the world's toxic exhaust into your own combustible fuel.
It is an incredibly empowering framework for personal growth.
It really is. But the book doesn't stop there. It actually pivots into some deeply unexpected territory.
It does. Which brings us to a theme that I think is the most fun to explore. Unconventional wisdom.
This is my favorite part.
Throughout the year, the author constantly highlights surprising, entirely counterintuitive ways to overcome our limitations. It feels like the text is actively subverting human expectations at almost every turn.
And nothing illustrates this subversion better than the parable of the donkey, found in the January 9th entry.
The donkey in the well.
I was so captivated by this story when I read it. It's an old parable, apparently originating from the Iberian Peninsula. The story goes like this. There's an old donkey that wanders off and accidentally falls into a very deep, dry well.
Not a great start for the donkey.
No. The owners hear him crying, they look down, and they do the math. The donkey is old, the well is dry and abandoned, and it's going to be way too much physical labor and expense to try and haul this heavy animal out.
So they make a pretty harsh call.
They make a terrible, incredibly cold decision. They decide to just bury him alive to put him out of his misery and fill in the dangerous well at the same time. They grab their shovels and start throwing heavy dirt down onto the donkey.
It is a genuinely brutal premise. But the reaction of the donkey is where the deep psychological wisdom lies.
Because what would you expect him to do?
Initially, you would fully expect the animal to just succumb to the terror, to panic, to freeze, and eventually be crushed by the weight of the dirt. That is the biological response to an inescapable threat. Learned helplessness.
Learned helplessness.
But instead, the donkey does something completely unexpected and highly adaptive. Every single time a heavy shovelful of dirt hits his back, he does two things. He shakes it off, and he takes a step up onto the new pile of dirt.
He shakes it off and he steps up.
Sacuda puera. Shake off the dust. It's brilliant. The very dirt that was intended to bury him, the very material meant to end his life, slowly begins to fill the bottom of the well. By continuously shaking off the weight and stepping on top of the adversity, the donkey eventually uses the dirt as a ramp to just walk right out of the top of the well.
He walks right out. And the author connects this directly and forcefully to human resilience. Life is absolutely going to throw dirt on you. Criticisms, professional failures, harsh words, gossip, systemic injustices.
And from a psychological standpoint, this story is the ultimate masterclass in reframing adversity. The circumstances that are meant to bury us can be the exact mechanisms that elevate us.
But only if we don't let the weight settle.
Exactly. Only provided we don't let the weight settle on our shoulders and crush our agency. The text explicitly says, have the facts as allies, not enemies. If you choose not to surrender to the panic, if you consciously choose to shake off the weight of the offense and step up, the very things trying to ruin you become the stairs that lead you out of the pit.
It completely changes everything about how you view a bad day. You stop asking the universe, why is this dirt falling on me? Why is this so unfair? And you start saying, great, more raw material for my ramp. Keep it coming.
Keep the dirt coming.
And this theme of counterintuitive solutions continues beautifully in the January 5th entry, which examines the story of the lame man at the beautiful gate from the book of Acts.
Let's look at the mechanics of that story. This is a man who has been unable to walk his entire life. Because of his condition, he is placed at the temple gate every single day to beg for alms.
Just to survive.
He sees two figures, Peter and John, approaching, and he asks them for some coins. He's asking for a temporary, superficial relief to an incredibly profound structural problem. He just wants enough small change to survive the afternoon.
But Peter and John don't give him money.
No, Peter says, I don't have silver or gold, but what I do have, I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ, walk. And the man is completely structurally healed.
The author draws such a sharp, convicting distinction here between asking for alms and receiving transformation. When you think about it, how often do we do exactly what that man did?
We do it all the time.
We have a massive structural problem in our lives. Maybe it's a deeply unfulfilling career, or a toxic relationship pattern, or a profound lack of self-worth. But instead of doing the deep, terrifying work to fix the structure, we just look for a quick fix.
We ask for coins.
We ask for coins. We look for a temporary distraction, a quick dopamine hit from scrolling social media, a small piece of external validation, or a new purchase. We ask for a Band-Aid when what is truly available and what we actually need is profound surgery.
We artificially limit our own possibilities because our expectations are just too low.
The text notes that we often settle for an alleviation of pain when a complete structural change is required.
We want the symptom managed, not the disease cured, because curing the disease actually requires effort. But to achieve that structural change, we sometimes have to undergo processes that make absolutely no sense to our logical modern minds.
Processes that look totally crazy.
This is highlighted perfectly and quite uncomfortably in the May 23rd entry titled, Beyond What the Eyes Can See.
Oh, the story of the blind man. I have to admit, this is one of the most bizarre and uncomfortable stories to read.
It's very strange.
Jesus encounters a man who has been blind from birth and decides to heal him. But he doesn't just speak a dramatic word or simply touch his eyes in a clean, clinical way. He spits into the dirt, makes a paste of mud with his saliva, and rubs that mud directly onto the blind man's eyes. Then he tells him to navigate his way to the pool of Siloam to wash it off.
I want to acknowledge that for a modern, logic-driven reader, this sounds entirely absurd. If you are blind, having someone smear mud on your eyes is not an intuitive step toward gaining sight.
It's the opposite.
It is messy, it is publicly humiliating, and it is profoundly uncomfortable. We want clean clinical data. We want a clear 5-step roadmap to healing that makes logical sense at every juncture.
But the psychological insight here is about the limits of our own logic when we are stuck in a deep rut.
The text emphasizes that the path to clarity or healing is often highly unorthodox. It requires relinquishing our desperate need to understand the mechanics of every single step before we actually take it. The blind man didn't stop and demand a peer-reviewed study on the efficacy of mud. He leaned into the messy process.
It is the ultimate lesson in trusting the process over the procedure. We want life to be a neat, predictable equation. But true growth is often muddy. You have to be willing to look foolish for a minute if you want to see clearly for a lifetime.
Looking foolish is part of the growth.
And speaking of looking foolish or feeling inadequate, the author spends a lot of time subverting our expectations about who gets chosen to do great things.
This is a recurrent and deeply encouraging theme. The idea that the improbable are often the most impactful. We see this explored in the August 4th entry regarding a figure named Naaman and the June 7th entry about Moses.
Let's start with Naaman.
Naaman was a prominent, highly respected Syrian army commander. He was a man of immense worldly power, adorned with medals, deeply proud. But he contracted leprosy. To find his cure, he had to set aside all of his societal status, take off his armor, and actually listen to the advice of a humble, captive servant girl in his household.
A captive servant girl. The commander of the entire army had to take health directions from a child with zero societal power.
Talk about a massive ego check.
If he hadn't swallowed his pride, he would have died of his disease. And then on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, there's Moses. He is called to lead an entire nation out of the oppressive superpower of Egypt. And his immediate response isn't to step up to the podium and take the mic.
Not at all.
His response is, who am I to do this? Yep. What if they don't believe me? I don't even speak well, I stutter. He feels entirely, overwhelmingly inadequate.
The contrast the author draws between these two figures is brilliant. Naaman had to overcome his blinding pride, while Moses had to overcome his paralyzing insecurity. But the unifying theme is this. Effectiveness in any grand mission, whether it's leading a nation or just breaking a generational cycle of trauma in your own family, does not rely on worldly status, perfect eloquence, or feeling ready.
You never feel ready.
The text explicitly states the call was never about your capacity, but about the presence of God. Translated into a broader secular application, your potential to impact the world relies entirely on your availability, your willingness to learn, and your humility, not on your current skill set or your title.
It is so freeing to realize that. You don't have to be the most polished speaker in the room. You don't need the fanciest degree or the perfect pedigree. You just have to be willing to show up and do the work, even if you feel like the most improbable, unqualified choice on the planet.
I think we all suffer from imposter syndrome at some point, and this is the perfect antidote.
Which serves as a perfect pivot into our final segment today. This is where the book takes all these individual lessons, dropping baggage and during the process shaking off dirt, and asks us to fundamentally rethink what we are doing with our time on this earth.
Yes, this is where the text transitions from what we might call personal development into profound existential reflection and legacy building. It actively challenges the modern cultural definition of a successful life.
Because what is success today?
If you survey society today and ask what it means to be successful, the metrics are almost universally tied to accumulation. The square footage of your house, the status of your job title, the digits in your bank account, the endless hustle to acquire more.
Right, it's the grind. Sleep when you're dead, hustle harder.
But the entries for January 10th and June 12th stop you dead in your tracks. The text references a deeply sobering concept from the biblical book of James, describing our human life as merely a vapor or a fog.
A vapor.
It appears for a little while, catches the morning light, and then it simply dissipates into nothing. When you are a kid, a summer feels like it lasts a decade. Time is endless. But as an adult, caught in the frantic, repetitive routine of paying bills and answering emails, the years just vanish. You blink and a decade is gone. You blink again, and your kids are grown and moving out.
The author argues passionately that recognizing the brevity of life requires us to take our foot off the accelerator.
He writes, what will make a difference is not the quantity of goods you accumulated or how much money is in your bank account, but how much you loved and enjoyed the company of those you love.
True success is entirely redefined in these pages. It is removed from the realm of the material and placed firmly in the realm of relational depth and intentionality.
And this brings us to a story that I genuinely consider the emotional core of this entire deep dive.
The knotted bedsheet.
Yes, it's from the January 6th entry.
I have to be honest with you. When I was reading this part of the source material, it completely broke my heart, but in the best way possible.
It's a very touching story.
The author tells the story of a father who worked exhaustive, punishing hours just to make ends meet. He was caught in that frantic pace of providing, always busy, always tired. Because of his schedule, he would come home late every single night, long after his young son was already asleep in bed.
It's a scenario that is painfully common. It's the modern dilemma of providing for a family while simultaneously feeling the profound guilt of being physically or emotionally absent from them.
Exactly. The guilt of the empty chair at dinner. But this father found a profound, simple, deeply creative way to communicate his presence and his love to his son. Every night, despite his utter exhaustion, he would walk into his son's dark room. He would gently kiss him goodnight so as not to wake him, and then he would take the corner of the boy's bedsheet and tie a simple knot in it.
A physical reminder.
That physical knot was a silent, tangible symbol. When the boy woke up in the morning and saw the knot at the foot of his bed, he knew exactly what it meant. My dad was here. He checked on me. I am loved. That imagery is incredibly potent because it strips away all our excuses. Building a legacy isn't necessarily about grand, sweeping gestures or taking your kids on luxury vacations.
It's not about the big trips.
The text compares building a legacy to the story of Noah building the ark. Noah protected his family from the flood by being intentional over a long period of time. The father, with the bedsheet, protected his son's heart through small, consistent, daily, micro-habits of affection.
Micro-habits of affection.
It is a direct rebuke to the modern idea that we are simply too busy to be present. You might not have 3 free hours to play a board game every night, but you have 10 seconds to tie a knot. You have time to leave a Post-it note on a mirror. You have time to send a random text of encouragement. These are the small, repetitive actions that actually anchor a child's sense of worth and build a lasting legacy. Micro-habits of affection. That's exactly what it is. And the text makes it clear that this intentionality shouldn't just be reserved for our immediate family. It has to extend outward to how we treat humanity as a whole.
The June 6th entry digs into the anatomy of true compassion.
The author quotes the French writer Anatole France, who said, "Compassion is what makes us truly human and keeps us from turning to stone."
The existential danger the author highlights here is compassion fatigue and the normalization of suffering. We live in a world saturated by a 24-hour news cycle. We have tragedy, injustice, and violence beamed directly into our pockets every hour of the day.
You just open your phone and it's all there.
In that environment, it is incredibly easy, almost biologically necessary for our hearts to grow cold, to become accustomed to the affliction of others, just to survive the mental load. But the text argues that true influence, what it calls being salt and light in the August 5th entry, is found exclusively in serving the oppressed and maintaining a soft heart.
It redefines greatness. Greatness isn't about pulling up a chair to a massive boardroom table so you can sit in a position of power and dictate terms. Greatness is about being an agent of reconciliation in places where you don't even have a voice or where there's no spotlight on you.
It requires an immense amount of courage to not conform to the apathy of the world, to actively resist turning to stone when you see the pain around you.
And tying this all back to the brevity of life we discussed earlier, the vapor, the June 9th entry, offers a final vital perspective. The realization that life is short should not paralyze us with fear.
It shouldn't push us into a state of nihilism where nothing matters.
Instead, the brevity of life should act as the ultimate catalyst. Knowing your time is severely limited should push you to live with absolute, unapologetic authenticity. The author states that living authentically means being entirely free from the paralyzing fear of other people's opinions. It means no longer letting your choices be dictated by the fear of not being accepted by the crowd.
Because if it's all a vapor anyway, why spend your vapor trying to impress people who don't actually care about your soul?
Right. It is about living grounded in non-negotiable principles, doing the deep work, rather than just endlessly chasing fleeting, dopamine-fueled pleasures to fill an inner void. It is about making absolutely sure that the incredibly short amount of time we have on this spinning rock is spent on things that actually matter, rather than the superficial, hollow metrics of success the world tries to force-feed us.
When you look at the text as a whole, it really provides a comprehensive, interconnected framework for living a meaningful life. From abandoning the heavy, useless luggage of our past mistakes to actively embracing and enduring the necessary polishing friction of our present circumstances, to intentionally seeding love and micro-habits of affection for the future.
It really is a masterclass in living well. So let's bring all of this together for you listening, because we have covered a massive amount of ground today. If you want to move forward and actually enjoy your life, you have to leave your excess baggage at the terminal. You have to stop paying the daily tax on grudges.
You cannot safely drive your life forward if you are staring exclusively into the rearview mirror.
You have to be willing to endure the dry, boring, polishing process of the desert, knowing that it is the exact training ground preparing you for the promise. When life inevitably throws heavy dirt on you, you have to find it within yourself to be like that donkey in the, well, don't panic, shake it off, step up, and use the adversity to build your ramp.
And most importantly, as you rush through this vapor of a life, do not forget to leave behind knots in the bedsheet for the people you truly love.
And I think it is important to reiterate as we close that while the specific insights we explored today are drawn from a distinct theological framework, a deep foundational trust in God the Father as presented by the author, the practical application of these principles is universally transformative.
Resilience, humility, the conscious reframing of adversity, and deep relational intentionality are mechanisms that will profoundly elevate any human life, regardless of where you are starting from.
Absolutely. The wisdom is universal. Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on. We talked extensively about that old donkey using the dirt thrown on him to build a ramp out of his darkest moment. I want you to take a second and think about the single biggest obstacle, criticism, or failure you are facing in your life right this very minute.
The thing that feels like it's burying you alive.
If you started treating that specific obstacle not as an unfair barrier, but as the exact raw material, the very dirt needed to build your ramp to the next level of your life, what is the very first step you would take differently tomorrow morning?
It completely changes the paradigm of how you view your struggles.
It really does. It puts the power back in your hands. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We hope it gave you some practical tools to lighten your load, some comfort for the journey, and a whole lot to think about. Keep exploring, keep questioning the narratives you tell yourself, and keep learning. We will catch you next time.